Good morning. This is chapter 3 in week 2. We will be talking about developmental psychology, and actually this is one of my favorite subjects. I believe that you can actually take a course that will last 12 weeks that will cover everything that we're going to cover in this 1 week. I embedded a video for you within the weekly announcement that'll give you visual of conception to birth. It's something that I use in my face-to-face courses, and I think that it's just a really great visual. What I decided to do is spend my time this week talking about the major theories, mainly because they are pretty important within the history and just the being of psychology. And so the first one I'll talk about is Piaget, and he believed in the cognitive theory, and he actually split his theory into 4 different stages, and he did address each stage with an age. That's important because, as you'll see, some of the ones that we'll talk about later today did not, but he went ahead and did place an age to each one of the stages. The thing to remember with this is that these are just estimations, and obviously there are children and individuals that will progress, as well as maybe some that may not be able to progress as quickly as Piaget believed they would. So the first one is sensory-motor stage, and he believed that this was birth to about 2 years old. And so what's going on during this stage is an individual or the infant is exploring their environment using their senses. If you've ever been around a baby, you know that they like to stick everything in their mouth. And so obviously they're looking, they are tasting things, they are touching things and trying to figure out really what their environment really is about. And this is how Piaget believed they learn at this first stage. At the end of this stage, he hopes that they would acquire some language, and most of the different developmental theorists will agree that a child should have some sort of language development by the age of 2. One of the important factors within sensory-motor stage is object permanence, and what this was Piaget believed that at about 18 months, an infant, if was shown an item and then was hidden, the child has the capacity to understand that the item is still there even though they can't see it. It didn't just explode or disappear, that it will reappear. The second stage is pre-operational, and he believed this was about 3 to 6 years old. And in this stage, the children would progress more in their language, and they started to use symbols that would represent ideas for them. If you've ever played house with a preschooler, you know that they can bring you a plate with checkers on it and say, "This is a cake I baked for you." And so they're using the checker as a symbol for the cake. They're very rule-oriented at this stage. You're either right or you're wrong. If you play a game with a preschooler or even a kindergartner, you will learn very quickly if you're doing something wrong because they have no problem telling you. They're very egocentric at this age, and really what that is looking at is they believe that whatever it is that they see, whatever it is that they think, they believe that everybody else thinks and sees the same exact thing. And so they're not able to understand that other people are going to see items or think about things differently. At this point, they do not understand conservation, and I believe your textbook had some different examples. The one I like to use and used with my children to check conservation was to take 5 pennies and place them in a row side by side. The child looks at those pennies, they may count them, and then the next thing you would need to do is just rearrange those pennies maybe to a square or into a circle, or maybe stack them and ask them how many pennies, is that the same or is that different than the first? And most children at the pre-operational stage will not be able to understand that it's still 5 pennies. It doesn't matter what organization they are in or how they're stacked or how they're positioned, that it's still 5 pennies. Children at the pre-operational stage will probably say that the stack of pennies actually holds more because it's taller. Concrete operational is the next stage, and that's between 7 and 12. Again, remember, these ages really obviously are just guidelines. Piaget believed at this stage that the child would be able to reverse their thinking. So if you tried that penny experiment with a child that was 7 to 12 years old, they can tell you it's the same amount. It's 5 pennies. It doesn't matter the way that they are arranged. Another one of the concepts was that the child will be able to start understanding adult logic, and if given a chance to determine whether something is right or wrong, they're actually going to look at different aspects of the situation to decide whether it's right or wrong. Remember, with pre-operational, those children, it's right or it's wrong. There's no wiggle room. But the concrete operational child will actually take what's going on into consideration before they make that decision. And the final stage is the formal operational, which Piaget believed was between the ages of 12 and adulthood. Obviously, they're going to reach maturity at this age. They should be able to hypothesize and be able to use logic to figure out ideas. Another one of the different theories is Lawrence Kohlberg, and he had a theory of moral development. And some of the things that are important with his theory to remember is that he did not tie any of his to an age. He believed it was going to happen. He just didn't say that it would happen between kindergarten and third grade. He just said it will happen as the child progresses. So he believed that there was a specific sequence, but there were not ages attached to it. And if they are not able to achieve the different roles at each of these different levels, then they aren't going to reach the highest level. Erik Erikson talked about psychosocial development, and in developmental psychology, this is another one of those theories that, especially if you go into nursing, you need to know. It's very well respected. If any of you have children or have the ability to view children, you can see this psychosocial development face to face, and it really does make a lot of sense. Now, your book actually doesn't talk about a couple of the stages, which I'm not quite sure why, but I'll go ahead and give you an overview of those 8 stages. The first one is trust versus mistrust, and at this stage, the infant is looking at the adult or the primary caregiver to take care of their needs. They are completely dependent on an individual to take care of them. And Erikson said that if the caregiver is not taking care of their needs, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, then they can develop mistrust. They don't know whether their needs are going to be taken care of. The second stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And at this age, they're usually trying to find personal control. They want to make choices. I'm sure you've seen commercials. Some of you may have children. Some of you may have nieces or nephews where you've seen them wearing an outfit that may not match. At this age is when, and usually preschool, is when they want to start making their own decisions. And so some parents say, okay, I don't care what you wear, but you have to have socks on today. And so they may not wear the same color socks, because really what they're trying to do is develop that sense of self, which again will come back to us in adolescence. The third and fourth level are initiative versus guilt and industry versus inferiority. And again, these are stages your book didn't talk about really, but again, this is kind of gaining that personal self-control, being able to make decisions and being happy with those decisions that they make. The next step that your book does talk about would be the identity versus role confusion, and this is adolescence. So think back to when you were an adolescent. Prior to that, you were getting a whole bunch of different messages from your parents, your teachers, your peers, maybe siblings. And, I think about it, are you Democrat? Are you Republican? Are you Christian? Are you Muslim? All sorts of different things that, choices that we have as an individual. And Erikson believed at this stage, the child or the adolescent was going to make or develop their identity, they would take all that information that they've learned from everybody else and make some choices on who they believe they were to be. Now, if they didn't have that luxury, or they didn't choose that, then that's when he believed that there would be role confusion. The individual or the adolescent wouldn't know really, who they are or what they want to be. The next stage in young adulthood would be intimacy versus isolation. And intimacy does not mean sexual contact. What we're talking about there is allowing someone to know the real you. And think about that. Do you act differently in front of your friends than you may act in front of your grandmother? Or if you're in church, do you act a little bit differently than you may at the grocery store? Most of us do. And so Erikson believed that intimacy was allowing somebody to know the real you. They know how you act at the grocery store. They know how you act at church. They know all your deepest secrets. So, in a young adulthood, being able to have some sort of a relationship with an individual at that level, or isolation. And so he believed that perhaps that individual would have a difficult time finding someone that they would want to hang around with. The next one is generativity versus stagnation, and this is middle age, and that's where I am. What we're looking at there is, what can you do to give back to the community? Are you volunteering? Are you do you have some life goals? Are you trying to reach them? And so generativity is that ability to give back or feel like you're doing something for the next generation, whereas stagnation is, I just sit and watch Netflix and I don't care about volunteering or whatever. And so Erikson said, let's make sure that that we're able to meet this stage, that we are setting goals, that we're helping each other, that type of thing. And the last one is integrity versus despair, and this is usually old age. And I really look at this as a life review. You've probably been retired for quite a few years. You sit back and look at your life. Those goals that you had as an adolescent, as middle age, did you achieve those? Are there some things that you wish you would have done? Are there some things that you wish you wouldn't have done? And what we find is individuals that are at this stage that look back on their life and with regret really do become bitter, and they may be the ones that kind of close themselves off from other people because, honestly, they're unhappy with the choices they made or didn't make. And so they choose to just kind of isolate themselves. Mary Ainsworth had some attachment styles, 3. And these are important because it really can determine how a child grows up. And so the first one is secure attachment, and this is the one that we want every child to have with their parent. This is a child that if you go to daycare, if you drop them off, they're probably a little bit upset that mom's leaving, but when she comes back, she's really happy, or the child's happy. And so my daughter actually works at an in-home daycare, and every once in a while I go in to just kind of, when I go to pick her up, and was happy to see that the mom that picked up her child obviously had secure attachment. That's not to say that if there's a secure attachment, there won't ever be issues with your children. That's not true. We have to factor in their free will, and they'll make choices, despite what we have taught them. And so secure attachment, though, is that bond with that caregiver or caregivers where you feel like you can trust them. The next one is avoidant attachment, and this is a child that if I was in that daycare setting, if mom got ready to leave, the child really wouldn't care. They'd just go off and do whatever it is they want to do. And they probably will ignore that caregiver when they return. Now, it's not because they're ignoring them because they're interested in what they're doing at the time. They're ignoring the caregiver because there really isn't a good secure attachment there. Perhaps the parent ignores the child quite a bit. Perhaps the child does not get a lot of one-on-one attention from that parent. And so the parent isn't as important to that child as they should be. The last one is ambivalent or resistant attachment, and this is just a disaster waiting to happen. Obviously, the child is very emotional. They're probably going to cry when mom leaves. They're going to cry when mom returns. However, with this ambivalent or resistant attachment, we sometimes see children that when mom does return, they're real happy to see her. And then if mom looks at them, they may get really upset. And this really comes from an environment where the child doesn't know what to expect from the parent. Maybe on Monday, mom was really very observant and they played toys and had a nice supper and bath time and bedtime story and everything was great. But maybe Tuesday, mom was really stressed out and she didn't pay attention to the child as much. And so this third parenting attachment is really based out of confusion. The child doesn't know what to expect from moment to moment with that parent. And the last thing I want to talk about is parenting styles, and they're important to remember. Authoritative is the parenting style that you want to have. An authoritative parent is one that is very accommodating. When I say that, I mean they may discuss rules and consequences with their children. They're going to explain why they might give a rule or a consequence. You're not going to hear them say, because I said so. They're very loving and respectful to their child, and really this is the one that we want to see parents use. The one that usually gets confused with authoritative is authoritarian, and I always give my face-to-face students this memory helpful hint. Authoritarian and ends in N. No, you do not want to be an authoritarian parent. An authoritarian parent is one that is very strict, has very specific rules, very probably forceful or even physical consequences. It's my way or the highway. I kind of think of like a drill sergeant type parent. They may care for their child, but what they care most about is compliance, and they will demand compliance if they don't get it. So there's not that warm, fuzzy parent relationship with authoritarian parent. The next one is permissive. These parents are very warm and supportive. They're great. They're warm and fuzzy. However, they really don't have any boundaries for their children. There's no consequence. There's really no rules. I really kind of see it as a free-for-all. The child doesn't have to check in after school. They may not have to have a curfew. And so communication between the parent and the child really is non-existent. They love their children, but their belief is that, the child can make the decisions and I'll just sit back and do whatever it is I do. The last one is uninvolved. They also leave their children to do things on their own. However, they're not very warm. They're not very encouraging. These are parents that they have children, but they really don't interact with them at all. An example I like to use, think about report card time and how an authoritative parent would respond to a bad grade. How about an authoritarian parent? How would they respond to a bad grade? The permissive parent, how would they respond to a bad grade? And then finally, the uninvolved parenting style, how would they interact with their child, or how would they react to a bad grade? So think about that, and that might help you also remember these 4 different parenting styles. Remember, I am available at any time. Please feel free to text me. Just make sure to include your name so I know who I'm talking to. And I hope that you have a good week.